Welcome back. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a warning. It was the autumn of 1932, in the middle of a storm-swept Appalachian night. A lone figure stumbled into St. Mary's Hospital in rural Virginia. Her body was thin and frail. Her clothes soaked in mud, and her swollen belly marked her as a woman on the edge of life and death. Nurses rushed to her side, but as they helped her onto a cot, a silence fell across the room. There was something about her, something that didn't belong in the world they knew. She called herself Mary Smith, but that name was a lie. Her real name, Sarah Holloway, belonged to a family shrouded in darkness, a dynasty that had hidden in a forgotten valley for 6 generations. The Holloways were not merely isolated. They were cursed, their bloodline twisted by centuries of intermarriage and secrets too horrific to speak aloud. And Sarah carried the latest, most extreme product of their inbreeding. Her eyes, wide and hollow, darted around the ward, seeming to see things no one else could. Her hands shook violently as she clutched the nurse's arm, muttering words that sounded like a forgotten dialect, echoes of a world cut off from civilization. She was malnourished, weak, and yet there was a determination in her gaze that made even seasoned hospital staff uneasy. For 3 long days she had walked from Devil's Hollow through frozen streams, dense forests, and jagged cliffs, driven by a desperation that could only come from one purpose: to save her unborn child. Every step she took was a gamble with death. Every night she slept on the cold ground, half delirious with hunger, fever, and exhaustion. But she pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that what she carried inside her womb deserved a life beyond the Hollow's cursed shadows. Inside her, the child was already extraordinary and horrifying. Sarah's previous pregnancies had ended in tragedy, malformed infants who could not survive the day. Each birth a testament to generations of genetic collapse. But this child, the one she now risked everything to save, seemed to carry a flicker of life and hope. It was the living result of 6 generations of twisted unions, a child whose DNA defied nature and medicine alike. As Sarah was settled onto the delivery bed, the attending physician, Dr. Margaret Hayes, sensed immediately that this would be no ordinary birth. She had delivered thousands of babies in her career, yet nothing could have prepared her for the horrors about to unfold. The labor was long and excruciating. Sarah's body bore the marks of her own genetic damage. The child's position defied every medical expectation, and when it finally emerged, Dr. Hayes realized she was witnessing history, not just medical history, but the darkest extremes of humanity. This infant, born on November 15, 1932, lived for only 17 minutes. 17 minutes that would shock doctors, haunt researchers, and eventually become a cornerstone of genetic science. Yet, in those brief moments, the child carried the weight of 6 generations of secrets, a living testament to the horrors hidden in the shadows of Devil's Hollow. Before we move on, remember this channel isn't for the faint of heart. If you're here, you crave the stories that keep others awake at night. Hit subscribe and tell me, what state are you listening from? Could you survive a story like this unfolding in your own backyard? Next, we travel back to 1847, when Jacob Holloway first arrived in Devil's Hollow, and the seed of a family curse was planted. Long before Sarah Holloway reached St. Mary's Hospital, the Petrused Holloway family had been building a legacy of darkness deep in the Appalachian Mountains. They called it Devil's Hollow, and few who heard the name dared to speak it aloud. The valley itself seemed cursed, a place where time slowed. The forests grew thick and wild, and nature conspired to keep outsiders from trespassing. Hunters' dogs refused to cross its borders. Travelers claimed to hear strange shapes moving through the trees, and the night carried an unnatural silence that pressed on the lungs. It was 1847 when Jacob Holloway first arrived, a man fleeing scandal, debt, and whispers of unspeakable crimes. He carried his wife Martha and their 7 children into the valley. Jacob's past was riddled with accusations of unnatural relations, scandalous and horrifying. With his name ruined and society's law pressing down on him, he needed a sanctuary where no one could interfere, a fortress hidden from the world. Devil's Hollow was perfect. Jagged cliffs and dense forests surrounded a secluded pocket of land, accessible only through a narrow pass that could be easily guarded. For Jacob, it wasn't just isolation. It was opportunity. Here he could enforce his own rules, protect his secrets, and mold a family in ways society would never allow. The valley was unforgiving, but it was safe from prying eyes, lawmen, and gossip. Inside this natural fortress, the Hulls began to twist their legacy. Jacob's control over his family was absolute. Martha, his wife, bore 3 more children under his watchful eyes before dying under suspicious circumstances. Some locals suspected foul play, but no one dared intervene. Jacob's authority went unchallenged, and his natural order took hold. Arranged marriages between siblings and cousins, designed to keep the bloodline concentrated and the family's secrets hidden forever. By 1860, the Holloway family had grown to more than 40 members, all living in ramshackle cabins, linked by secret paths through the dense forest. They spoke their own dialect, worshipped in ways that would horrify outsiders, and obeyed laws that existed nowhere else on earth. Government officials, census takers, and tax collectors all gave up trying to find them. The Hollways were an island of darkness in a world moving forward, untouched, even as the Civil War raged around them. Under Jacob's son Thomas, the family's isolation deepened further. Thomas was different from his calculating father. He was ruled by primitive impulses and twisted belief that their deformities were divine marks. Inbreeding had already begun to manifest. Children were born with extra fingers, malformed limbs, and facial abnormalities so severe that survival was rare. Thomas saw these anomalies, mutations, not as warnings, but as proof of holiness, a sign that the Holloways were chosen to transcend humanity. This was the world Sarah Holloway would be born into, one where survival itself was an act of defiance, and every life carried the weight of centuries of genetic damage. Devil's Hollow was more than a home. It was a crucible of corruption, a place where humanity's darkest instincts had been allowed to fester unchecked. Next, we meet Sarah herself, the child of generations of inbreeding, and the journey that led her to escape the Hollow and change medical history forever. Before the Holloway curse could fully take root, Jacob Holloway carried the shadows of his past into the valley. Born in Pennsylvania, Jacob was a man whose reputation was already stained with whispers too terrible to repeat aloud. Court records unearthed decades later showed accusations of unnatural relations with his own daughters. Charges vanished when key witnesses mysteriously withdrew, but the stain on his name remained indelible. In a world obsessed with reputation and law, Jacob became a fugitive, not just of justice, but of morality itself. When he arrived in Devil's Hollow with his wife Martha and 7 children, Jacob wasn't simply seeking refuge. He was hunting freedom for the darkest parts of himself. The valley was perfect, surrounded by jagged cliffs and impenetrable forests. It was isolated, secret, and impossible for outsiders to reach without his knowledge. Even the local Cherokee tribes had long avoided the place, calling it a land where spirits grew sick. For Jacob, that isolation wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Martha, once naive and hopeful, soon became a witness to Jacob's control. Within the shadowed cabins of Devil's Hollow, Jacob began shaping the family into an instrument of secrecy and survival. He introduced a system of arranged marriages among siblings and cousins, a cruel mechanism designed to concentrate the bloodline and shield the family's secrets. It was the beginning of a legacy that would twist genes, minds, and morality across generations. By the time of Martha's death in 1854, under circumstances that outsiders would later suspect were suspicious, Jacob's dominion over the Hollways was absolute. The local sheriff, ill-equipped and wary of the treacherous terrain, could do little more than record her death as fever. No investigation followed. No one dared challenge the lawlessness Jacob had created. In the darkness of Devil's Hollow, morality was dictated not by society but by Jacob himself. Jacob's eldest daughter, Rebecca, became the first to embody his vision of the natural order. At 16, she was married to her own brother Thomas, beginning the twisted chain of unions that would bring unimaginable genetic consequences. Their first child, born in 1856, marked the start of a lineage of deformity, disease, and physical abnormalities. Children born into suffering that no one outside the valley could imagine. By the 1860s, the Holloway family had expanded to over 40 members. Hidden pathways connected their ramshackle cabins, while outsiders, government census takers, and tax collectors all learned to leave the valley alone. The family had created a microcosm governed by fear, superstition, and secrecy. Even as the Civil War raged around them, the Hollways remained untouched, a growing pocket of darkness, isolated from the outside world. Jacob's legacy was more than mere survival. It was a meticulous cultivation of isolation, control, and twisted devotion. He laid the groundwork for generations of inbreeding, ensuring that the Hollow bloodline would remain closed, concentrated, and increasingly fragile. The seeds of genetic collapse were planted alongside the family's twisted code of conduct. By the time Sarah Holloway was born, the Holloway curse was already fully blooming. A family shaped by secrecy, scandal, and genetic manipulation, bound together by fear and dark devotion. Devil's Hollow had become more than a place. It was a crucible of human depravity, where morality and biology collided in the most terrifying ways imaginable. Next, we dive into the next generation, where Thomas Holloway rises to power, and the family's isolation begins to transform into a genetic nightmare that will culminate in Sarah's tragic birth. With Jacob Holloway gone in 1871, the shadow of Devil's Hollow passed into the hands of Thomas Holloway, the son and brother who had been shaped by his father's twisted rule. Unlike Jacob, Thomas was not calculating. He was raw, primal, and driven by impulses that ignored morality, reason, or consequence. Years of inbreeding had already begun to warp the family, physically and mentally. Thomas suffered violent mood swings, periods of dissociation, and developmental disabilities that modern psychiatrists would classify as severe. Yet, within the isolation of Devil's Hollow, these traits became a twisted form of authority. Under Thomas, the valley's isolation grew more complete. Any family member who dared speak to outsiders faced brutal punishment. Outsiders who stumbled upon the Hollowlands described strange, chilling sounds echoing through the forests at night. Screams, chants, and noises that seemed almost inhuman. Men who heard them never returned, leaving the Hollways untouched, a dark pocket of humanity hidden from the world. The physical consequences of inbreeding became horrifyingly visible. Children were born with extra fingers, missing limbs, or faces so malformed that survival was a daily battle. Bones fractured easily, organs developed outside the body, and some infants could barely breathe. But Thomas interpreted these mutations not as warnings. They were proof of divinity. To him, every deformity was a sign that the family was chosen, evolving into something beyond human, destined for greatness that outsiders could not comprehend. Rebecca, Thomas's sister and wife, bore 11 children over 18 years, though only 6 survived past infancy. Those who lived were marked by the accumulated genetic damage of 3 generations. Even as they grew, the valley became a laboratory of suffering where human limits were tested with every birth. Local legends studied day in HPER that the Holloways themselves began to believe they were no longer entirely human, creatures marked by God, elevated by their suffering. By the 4th generation, the nightmare reached new extremes. Siblings, uncles, nieces, and even fathers married daughters within the family, guided by Thomas's rigid rules. The result was children who could barely move, speak, or comprehend reality. Some had faces twisted almost beyond recognition, eyes misaligned, limbs fused or missing. These children were the living evidence of humanity's limits, proof that genetic isolation could devastate even the strongest will to survive. Amid this horror, Sarah Holloway was born. She was the product of her grandfather Joseph's union with her aunt Elizabeth, making her simultaneously a granddaughter and great-granddaughter to the same man. With parents sharing over 75% of their DNA, Sarah's birth was nothing short of miraculous. Her tiny, fragile body bore the early signs of a lineage steeped in genetic catastrophe. A malformed skull, underdeveloped limbs, and a fight for life written into every cell. Yet Sarah survived where so many others had perished. Her intellect developed despite the twisted environment, allowing her to read, write, and understand the limited knowledge preserved within Devil's Hollow. But even as a prodigy, she was imprisoned by the valley's horrors and her family's monstrous legacy. The seeds of her eventual escape, driven by a maternal instinct to save her child from the same fate, had already begun to grow. Devil's Hollow under Thomas was no longer merely a family home. It had become a breeding ground for genetic horror, a place where nature and cruelty collided, and the cost of isolation manifested in living, breathing tragedy. Every birth carried the echo of centuries-old secrets, a warning of what happens when humanity is cut off from the world and left to hide its darkest instincts. In the depths of Devil's Hollow, amid twisted forests and crumbling cabins, Sarah Holloway came into the world in 1912, a fragile thread in a tapestry of genetic horror. Born to parents who shared over 75% of their DNA, Sarah was a walking paradox, a miracle of survival wrapped in a nightmare of hereditary damage. From her earliest moments, it was clear she was different. Her skull was misshapen, her left arm ended abruptly at the elbow, and her body bore the subtle signs of generations of inbreeding. But unlike many of her siblings, Sarah's mind sparkled with the rare glimmer of cognition that had somehow survived the genetic storm. Life in Devil's Hollow was a test of endurance. Her siblings often succumbed to deformities or illnesses too severe to survive infancy. Every corner of the valley whispered the consequences of the family's isolation: failed births, broken bones, and cries of children whose minds never fully developed. But Sarah grew. By the age of 4, she learned to walk. By 6, she spoke her first words, and as the years passed, she devoured knowledge from the few moldering books the family possessed, copying letters in a cramped, uneven hand. Even in a place designed to crush human potential, Sarah flourished in her own peculiar way. Her intellect did not go unnoticed. Within the twisted hierarchy of the Holloway family, Sarah became a prodigy, a young girl who could interpret the archaic texts, count with precision, and observe patterns that her elders, impaired by generations of inbreeding, could not comprehend. She understood the dangers that lurked in every corner, the unspoken rules that bound the valley, and the consequences of defying her great-uncle Abel's authority. Survival meant being clever, patient, and cautious. Sarah had all three in abundance. Yet the valley's darkness pressed constantly against her mind. The family's rituals, blood offerings, twisted prayers, and acts that even medical professionals later refused to describe were a backdrop to every day. Abel, towering and mentally childlike, ruled with superstition, interpreting deformities as divine signs and enforcing strict obedience. Children were punished for curiosity, for speaking to outsiders, for asking questions about the world beyond the valley, and still Sarah observed, learned, and endured. By the time she reached adolescence, Sarah had grown into a young woman whose intellect and resilience outshone the physical limitations imposed by her body. She understood the family's twisted rules and recognized the trajectory of horror that awaited her child if she remained. Her first 2 pregnancies had ended tragically, miscarried, due to the overwhelming genetic damage inherited over generations. Each loss carved a new layer of determination into her spirit. The valley had trained Sarah for survival, but it had also given her the clarity to dream of escape. She realized that the child she carried in her third pregnancy deserved something the valley could never offer. Life outside the shadows. Something primal. Maternal instinct. Perhaps even the first flickers of morality to break through centuries of inbreeding, drove her toward a decision that would defy her family and the twisted legacy they represented. Sarah Holloway, the fragile child of a cursed lineage, was about to take the first steps in a journey that would carry her into the wider world, into St. Mary's Hospital in Virginia, and into the annals of medical history. The valley's darkness would not follow her entirely. Its echoes were etched into her DNA, but her courage and intellect would shine through just long enough to give her child the chance she never had. Next, we follow Sarah's desperate escape from Devil's Hollow, a perilous journey that will test her endurance, courage, and maternal resolve as she seeks safety for her unborn child. By late October 1932, Sarah Holloway knew she had reached a breaking point. The twisted legacy of Devil's Hollow, the endless cycle of inbreeding, deformity, and ritualized horror, had reached her unborn child. Her first two pregnancies had ended in miscarriage, casualties of generations of genetic collapse. But this third child, though conceived in the same cursed valley, deserved a chance at life beyond the shadow of the whole curse. The decision to leave was not sudden. It had been growing inside her like a slow burning fire, fed by despair, instinct, and the faint glimmer of hope. The night of escape was chosen with precision. The valley's darkness was near total during the new moon. Abel deep in one of his religious trances, Sarah moved silently through the ramshackle cabins, avoiding her male relatives and the watchful eyes of the family's enforcers. With nothing but the clothes on her back and $70 stolen from Marcus' hidden stash, she stepped into the cold, forbidding night. She had never ventured more than 5 miles from the whole compound in her life, yet the urgency to save her child lent her a courage that decades of conditioning had never allowed. Her journey was a nightmare of physical and psychological endurance. 8 months pregnant, malnourished, and weakened from a lifetime of deprivation, Sarah navigated treacherous Appalachian wilderness. She survived on wild berries and stream water, sleeping in caves and hollowed logs. Every snapping twig, every distant howl reminded her that the world beyond the Holloway lands was unknown and dangerous. Exhaustion and fever threatened to claim her, but the thought of her unborn child spurred her forward. The cries of infants past, lost to the family's twisted experiments and inbreeding, haunted her steps. She would not allow history to repeat itself. The mountains tested her body and spirit. Slopes, steep as cathedral walls, sudden rockfalls, and raging streams demanded every ounce of strength she possessed. At times she collapsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Yet each time she rose, driven by an obsessive certainty, her child deserved life outside Devil's Hollow. For the first time, Sarah glimpsed the possibility of freedom, a chance to live as a mother, not merely as a survivor of centuries of family horror. After 3 grueling days, she stumbled onto a narrow dirt road, her body trembling and feverish. A traveling salesman, Robert Welsh, discovered her collapsed beside his automobile. Her mutterings about devils, angels, and screaming children sounded like the ramblings of madness to an ordinary man, but Welsh's compassion overrode suspicion. He loaded her into his car and drove straight to St. Mary's Hospital in rural Virginia, unaware that he was carrying the culmination of America's darkest genetic experiment. Upon arrival, Sarah registered under the false name Mary Smith, convincing the hospital staff that she was an abandoned wife with no family. Her dialect, her appearance, and the obvious effects of genetic damage were unusual, but not alarming enough to trigger deep investigation. Yet, what the nurses and doctors could not have imagined was what would emerge from her womb, a child whose very existence would shatter their understanding of human heredity. Sarah's escape from Devil's Hollow was more than a physical journey. It was a desperate act of rebellion against generations of cruelty, secrecy, and genetic collapse. In those harrowing days, through suffering, fear, and determination, she became more than a victim. She became a mother, willing to defy fate itself. The darkest chapter of the Holloway family was about to be revealed, not in the mountains, but in the sterile, shocked silence of St. Mary's delivery room. Next, we witness the birth of the CERN, the most inbred child in history, a moment that will haunt the hospital staff and leave an indelible mark on medical science. The cold November night of 1932 was ordinary for St. Mary's Hospital in rural Virginia, except for the arrival of a young woman whose presence would soon make medical history. Under the name Mary Smith, Sarah Holloway staggered into the hospital, her body exhausted from a perilous 3-day trek through the Appalachian wilderness. 8 months pregnant, feverish and malnourished, she clutched the meager $17 she had stolen from Marcus' stash, a last link to the family she had fled. Her eyes, vacant yet focused, betrayed both terror and determination. The nurses whispered among themselves, intrigued and unsettled by her archaic dialect, handmade clothing, and the strange aura of someone who had lived entirely apart from modern civilization. Sarah's labor began after 3 days of complications. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a seasoned physician with over 30 years and 3,000 births under her belt, immediately sensed something extraordinary was unfolding. Sarah's malformed pelvis and her child's impossible positioning defied all obstetric knowledge. The delivery was unlike anything Hayes or anyone else in the room had ever encountered. Every minute felt drawn out, every contraction, a reminder that life and death were balanced on a knife's edge. When the child finally emerged, it was almost unrecognizable as human. The infant's skull was elongated, partially collapsed, giving the head a triangular shape. Oversized eyes bulged from their sockets. The left arm was entirely absent, ending in smooth skin at the shoulder, while the right arm bore 7 fingers arranged, as if 2 separate limbs had merged in a grotesque experiment of nature. The legs were fused from the hip down, a single mass with multiple bone structures, creating a form that no textbook could explain. The hospital staff recoiled, shock turning to horror. Standard procedures were useless. Oxygen masks did not fit. IV lines could not be inserted, and even weighing the infant posed challenges as the body refused to conform to known human dimensions. The child's internal anatomy was equally catastrophic, a heart beating irregularly, lungs malformed, and a nervous system so damaged that consciousness existed only in fleeting unresponsive sparks. In desperation, Dr. Hayes called upon Dr. Edmund Carver, a geneticist from the University of Virginia who specialized in hereditary disorders of isolated populations. Within hours, Carver arrived, documenting the infant from every conceivable angle. He immediately recognized the truth. This child was the product of decades of extreme inbreeding, with parents sharing over 90% of their DNA, a level approaching the theoretical limits of human reproduction. For 17 minutes, the child lived. In those fleeting moments, the room was a crucible of horror and fascination. Carver collected tissue samples, photographs, and notes that would later become the cornerstone of modern understanding of genetic compression and hereditary collapse. The child's brief life became a haunting testament to the extremes of human heredity and the consequences of isolation, secrecy, and perverse control. Sarah, sedated and exhausted, received the news with a calm that unsettled the staff. She accepted that her child's fate had been sealed the moment of conception. Yet, in fleeing Devil's Hollow, she had achieved something profound. She had chosen courage, resistance, and the chance for her child to be remembered. The legacy of Devil's Hollow, its twisted rituals, brutal inbreeding, and generational suffering, had finally been confronted outside the valley. That night, St. Mary's Hospital became the stage for a tragedy that was also a revolution in medical science. A moment where humanity glimpsed the limits of genetics and the consequences of secrets buried for generations. And the delivery room fell into an uneasy silence as the reality of the infant before them sank in. For 17 minutes, life and death hung in the balance. Each second, a chilling reminder of the genetic nightmare Sarah had carried to term. Dr. Margaret Hayes, seasoned and unflappable, felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She had delivered thousands of babies, yet none had tested the limits of human anatomy and heredity in the way this child did. The infant's body was a grotesque symphony of nature gone airy. The skull, elongated and partially collapsed, distorted the shape of the face. Eyes bulged unnaturally, and the left arm was absent, leaving a smooth shoulder. The right arm bore 7 fingers, seemingly attempting to form 2 separate limbs. The legs were fused from hip to foot, a single malformed appendage containing multiple bone structures. Every physical feature screamed centuries of inbreeding and isolation. Yet the child's presence was oddly, hauntingly human, a living testament to both fragility and resilience. The medical team scrambled, their training useless against this anomaly. Standard pediatric procedures, oxygen masks, IV lines, and routine monitoring were nearly impossible. The infant's internal systems were equally catastrophic. A chaotic heart, misaligned lungs, and a nervous system so compromised that consciousness flickered like a dying candle. Each breath was a struggle, a testament to the genetic collapse that had been centuries in the making. Within hours, Dr. Edmund Carver arrived, carrying the weight of decades of genetic study and the curiosity of a man unafraid to confront human extremities. He immediately recognized the truth. The child was the product of extreme consanguinity, with parents sharing over 90% of their DNA. Such a level of genetic similarity was nearly impossible outside the realm of identical twins. Carver knew he was witnessing something unprecedented, a living illustration of the consequences of complete genetic isolation compounded over generations in Devil's Hollow. During those 17 agonizing minutes, Carver documented every detail. He photographed the infant from multiple angles, collected tissue samples, and recorded meticulous notes on each deformity. He knew that despite the tragedy, these records would become a cornerstone in understanding hereditary collapse, inbreeding, and the ultimate fragility of human genetics. Each observation revealed not just physical abnormalities, but the invisible scars of 6 generations of familial secrecy and twisted customs. As the infant's heartbeat finally faltered and then ceased, a profound silence enveloped the room. The medical staff, though trained for emergencies, were left with horror, awe, and disbelief. They had not merely delivered a child. They had witnessed the culmination of a century-long genetic experiment gone terribly wrong. Sarah, exhausted and sedated, absorbed the news with an unsettling calm, as if a part of her had always known her child's fate. The tragedy, however, carried a grim clarity. For the first time, the hidden horrors of Devil's Hollow reached beyond the valley, revealing the staggering consequences of isolation, inbreeding, and human secrecy. That infant, alive for only 17 minutes, had become an unintentional teacher. Its brief existence illuminated the extremes of human heredity, providing knowledge that would shape the understanding of genetics for decades to come. Next, we follow Dr. Carver's secretive research over 40 years, uncovering the moral and scientific lessons of Devil's Hollow and Sarah's final tragic journey. The birth of Sarah Holloway's child in 1932 was not just a tragedy. It was the spark that ignited a lifetime of clandestine research for Dr. Edmund Carver. He returned to the University of Virginia shaken, haunted by the infant's grotesque deformities, the extreme genetic isolation that had created it, and the decades of secrecy that had allowed Devil's Hollow to exist undisturbed. For Carver, the case was not simply scientific curiosity, it was a moral imperative. Over the next 4 decades, Carver worked in near total secrecy. He built a private archive of photographs, tissue samples, and meticulously reconstructed family trees. Each discovery revealed another layer of horror. Siblings married to siblings, cousins reproducing within the bloodline, and in some cases, parents taking nieces or daughters as partners. By the time Carver mapped the Hollow lineage, the genetic coefficient of inbreeding was so extreme that it defied comprehension, surpassing anything recorded in modern scientific studies. Carver's notes detail conditions so severe that some children never learned to speak, walk, or even recognize their own reflections. Facial deformities, missing limbs, extra digits, and fused organs were common. Yet, they were only the visible tip of the iceberg. Internally, organs often failed to develop properly. Brains were malformed, and entire nervous systems were compromised. The Holloway family represented a genetic experiment in living form, a warning about what could happen when human isolation and secrecy were taken to their ultimate extreme. Despite the horrific nature of his findings, Carver understood the danger of publishing them prematurely. The 1930s were rife with eugenic ideology, and he feared that revealing the full scope of Devil's Hollow might encourage the very practices he abhorred. Instead, he shared his findings only with a few trusted colleagues, those bound by both academic integrity and secrecy. Yet Carver's work was not solely about horror. He recognized patterns, learned from deviations, and slowly pieced together how generations of inbreeding created cumulative genetic damage. His research became foundational in understanding the mechanisms of recessive traits, genetic bottlenecks, and the importance of diversity in human populations. Every tissue sample, every photograph, every reconstructed family tree was a lesson in the limits of heredity and the profound consequences of ignoring them. Carver's obsession with Devil's Hollow was fueled not only by science, but by the lingering question: could Sarah's child have survived under different circumstances? For him, the 17 minutes of life that child had were both a tragedy and a revelation, a fleeting glimpse into the consequences of choices made generations earlier. By the 1970s, Carver's health began to fail, but his resolve did not. He ensured that his archives were secure, that his notes and samples could withstand the passage of time. He knew that the story of Devil's Hollow was too important to be lost. A warning to humanity about the dangers of isolation, secrecy, and genetic arrogance. Carver's research remained hidden until 1984, when facing terminal illness. He decided that the world needed to see the Holloway family, not as a curiosity or a spectacle, but as a cautionary tale etched in DNA. The lessons of Devil's Hollow were ready to escape the shadows and finally be understood. Next, we explore the publication of Carver's paper, the revelation of Devil's Hollow to the world, and the moral and scientific legacy left behind by 6 generations of secrecy, isolation, and tragedy. By 1984, Dr. Edmund Carver was, in his 80s, frail, and facing terminal cancer, but his mind remained razor-sharp. For decades, he had carried the terrifying secrets of Devil's Hollow, and now he knew the world needed to witness them, not as morbid curiosity, but as a cautionary tale etched in human DNA. After carefully organizing over 40 years of data, photographs, tissue samples, and reconstructed family trees, Carver submitted his paper to the Journal of Human Genetics. The title alone caused a stir: Extreme Consanguinity in an Isolated Population, a case study in genetic collapse. Within months of publication, the scientific community was ablaze. Geneticists, anthropologists, and ethicists debated the findings. Many horrified, some skeptical, others stunned by the unprecedented scale of human hereditary isolation Carver had documented. The Holloway family wasn't just unusual. It represented a genetic bottleneck so severe that it had created a new, almost unrecognizable category of human being. Carver's paper revealed the staggering truth. 6 generations of inbreeding had produced deformities, developmental delays, and severe medical anomalies so extreme that reproduction with outsiders would have been virtually impossible. even if the family had desired it. Every photograph of the whole children told the same story: eyes set impossibly, limbs twisted, faces malformed, expressions vacant or confused. Even surviving family members bore the accumulated weight of centuries of genetic damage. The revelation sent shockwaves far beyond the academic world. Ethical debates erupted over the responsibilities of isolated communities, the dangers of genetic bottlenecks, and the consequences of human secrecy and insularity. Carver's meticulous documentation provided not only scientific insight, but a stark moral lesson. Isolation, whether social, moral, or genetic, could eke for generations with devastating consequences. 3 years later, in 1987, researchers finally located Devil's Hollow itself. By then, the valley had returned to wilderness. The Holloway cabins had crumbled, overgrown with dense forest. The cemetery contained over 200 graves, most unmarked, and the remains of infants and children bore silent testimony to the genetic catastrophe that had unfolded there. Devil's Hollow, once a living experiment in isolation, had become a ghostly monument to the dangers of human hubris and secrecy. Carver's work remains a cornerstone of modern genetics, studied by scientists to understand the limits of heredity and the mechanisms of recessive disorders. Ethicists reference Devil's Hollow in debates over the moral responsibilities of human reproduction and community isolation. And yet, beyond the science, the story resonates on a deeply human level. It is a reminder that the darkest secrets, when left unchecked, can haunt generations, that isolation, physical or moral, comes at a cost, and that the fragile web of humanity can be stretched to its breaking point. Sarah Holloway's child, alive for only 17 minutes, became the living emblem of all these consequences. Though its life was brief, its legacy endures, haunting researchers, historians, and anyone who studies the extremes of human heredity. The tragedy of Devil's Hollow is both timeless and universal, a story of nature, nurture, and the consequences of secrets kept too long. Next, we explore the aftermath of Devil's Hollow's discovery, the hidden archives, and the moral lessons that continue to shape our understanding of genetics and humanity itself. The discovery of Devil's Hollow in 1987 sent shivers down the spines of everyone involved. What had once been whispered about in Appalachian legends, a valley cursed by generations of secrecy, was now laid bare for the world to see. Researchers found overgrown cabins, crumbling walls, and a cemetery of unmarked graves, remnants of a family whose obsession with isolation had created a human experiment gone horribly wrong. Every artifact, every fragment of a diary, every photograph of deformed children told the same haunting story. The Hollways had pushed the limits of human heredity to the brink. Dr. Carver's decade-long research became the key to unlocking the moral and scientific lessons of Devil's Hollow. Modern geneticists pored over his data, studying how extreme consanguinity could result in catastrophic physical and cognitive impairments. Children born with fused limbs, malformed organs, or neurological damage became more than statistics. They were evidence of the consequences of generational isolation. Each genetic anomaly was a warning etched in DNA, a reminder that nature has limits, even human curiosity sometimes ignores. But the story of Devil's Hollow is not only a tale of science, it is also a cautionary narrative about secrecy, control, and the human cost of power unchecked. For decades, the Hollow patriarchs had ruled with fear, dictating marriages, breeding strategies, and religious rituals. The consequences were as moral as they were genetic. A society twisted by superstition, violence, and distorted beliefs about destiny and divine favor. Even as the family disappeared from the mountains, their legacy persisted, not just in DNA, but in the cautionary tales whispered among the surrounding communities. Ethicists and historians now study Devil's Hollow alongside Carver's work, using it to discuss the responsibilities of society, science, and family. It is a stark reminder that human isolation, whether physical, social, or genetic, can leave scars not only on individuals, but on entire lineages. The Hollow tragedy also underscores the importance of genetic diversity, access to health care, and ethical oversight in cases where communities are isolated from the world. For those who seek a more visceral understanding, the human toll is inescapable. The child born to Sarah Holloway in 1932, alive for only 17 minutes, embodied 6 generations of secrets, cruelty, and twisted choices. Its brief existence crystallized the horrors of a family that had placed isolation above compassion, control above humanity. That infant's life, though fleeting, became a beacon for researchers, ethicists, and storytellers alike, a living warning that some sins once committed echo far longer than anyone can imagine. Today, Devil's Hollow remains a place of fascination and dread. Scholars continue to study the whole genetic records. Journalists revisit the story. Local folklore keeps the memory alive. The valley reclaimed by nature stands silent yet eloquent, a monument to the perils of human obsession and secrecy. Sarah's courage in fleeing her family and the brief life of her child remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, small acts of defiance and conscience can shine through, offering a fragile hope amid horror. Next, we will examine the ongoing influence of the Hollow case on modern genetics, ethical debates, and how this extraordinary story continues to shape our understanding of heredity, isolation, and the human spirit. Even decades after the Hollow tragedy, Devil's Hollow refuses to fade from scientific, ethical, and public consciousness. The case has become a benchmark for extreme consanguinity, referenced in medical textbooks, genetic research, and ethical debates worldwide. Dr. Edmund Carver's work, once hidden away in a private vault, now serves as a cautionary cornerstone, reminding humanity that isolation, whether social, moral, or genetic, can have consequences that echo for generations. Modern geneticists continue to study the Holloway data to understand how inherited disorders compound over multiple generations. The extreme cases of limb deformities, malformed organs, and neurological impairments provide a rare, horrifying glimpse into the upper limits of human genetic compression. Researchers have even compared the Hollow family to controlled laboratory studies, noting that no laboratory model has ever produced such catastrophic outcomes in humans. Every photograph, tissue sample, and documented family tree adds a layer of understanding and a layer of dread. But the influence of Devil's Hollow extends beyond science. Ethicists use the case to explore questions of human rights, reproductive ethics, and the moral obligations of isolated communities. How far can authority over one's family or community go before it becomes a violation of basic human dignity? The Hallways illustrate what can happen when fear, superstition, and secrecy dictate human behavior for generations. It is a stark reminder that morality and genetics are intertwined. The decisions we make affect not just ourselves, but the generations that follow. The story also resonates culturally. Folklorists, historians, and storytellers draw inspiration from Devil's Hollow, highlighting the dangers of secrets kept too long and the destructive power of insular thinking. Appalachian communities still whisper tale of the Cursed Valley, where deformity and despair once reigned. The Kulo Hisrii narrative of Sarah Holloway, the young woman who escaped the horrors of her family, continues to inspire discussions about courage, defiance, and the fight to protect future generations from inherited harm. The Holloway case also serves as a warning in the age of modern genetics and reproductive technologies. With advancements in gene editing, IVF, and population genetics, scientists constantly confront questions about intervention, prevention, and ethical responsibility. Devil's Hollow is a grim historical benchmark, showing what can happen when heredity is manipulated, whether through intentional isolation or generations of unchecked inbreeding. Perhaps most haunting is the memory of Sarah's child, alive for only 17 minutes, yet carrying within its tiny body the accumulated consequences of 6 generations. That infant's brief life transformed from a personal tragedy into a universal, lesson, reminding the world that some genetic and moral mistakes cannot be undone, and that even the smallest acts of courage, like Sarah's flight from Devil's Hollow, can leave a lasting imprint. Today, Devil's Hollow stands as a symbol, a study, and a warning. Its legacy shapes how we understand genetics, ethics, and the human spirit. It is a story of isolation, horror, resilience, and the cost of keeping secrets buried too long. Next, we will dive into the personal stories of the surviving Holloway descendants, their encounters with the modern world, and how the echoes of Devil's Hollow continue to haunt human history. Even after Devil's Hollow was abandoned and reclaimed by the mountains, the echoes of the Holloway family continue to resonate. Descendants who survived the genetic catastrophe faced a world that was entirely foreign, where their deformities, behaviors, and knowledge of the family's twisted history marked them as outsiders. While some attempted to assimilate, others carried the burden of ancestral isolation and trauma with them, haunted not only by physical deformities, but by the shadows of their family's deeds. Among the few who left the valley, stories emerged of children with malformed limbs, cognitive delays, and faces that seemed to reflect generations of inbreeding. These individuals struggled to navigate society, often misunderstood or feared by those unaware of their history. Yet within these tragedies lay stories of resilience. Sarah Holloway's distant relatives, though carrying some of the genetic weight, survived, adapted, and bore witness to the horrors of the past. Their very existence became living proof of the complex interplay between heredity, environment, and human spirit. Anthropologists and genealogists who traced these descendants discovered a strange phenomenon. Many carried surprising talents, heightened intuition, and a certain eerie acuity, traits interpreted by the family as signs of divine favor, but by scientists as anomalies in genetic expression. These traits, coupled with the obvious physical and mental challenges, created a population both fascinating and tragic. Interviews with surviving family members revealed a duality of existence, pride in lineage mixed with the burden of an unforgiving genetic legacy. The social consequences were equally stark. Schools, neighbors, and local communities often ostracized Holloway descendants, driven by fear, prejudice, or superstition. Rumors of cursed blood persisted, fueled by the bizarre deformities documented in newspapers and medical journals. Some descendants hid their heritage entirely, changing names and relocating to cities far from Appalachia. Others embraced it, preserving family records, letters, and journals, determined to ensure that the lessons of Devil's Hollow would not be forgotten. Modern geneticists studying these descendants faced ethical dilemmas. How much intervention was appropriate? How could the scientific world help without exploiting their suffering? The Holloway case became a touchstone for debates on genetic counseling, reproductive ethics, and the responsibilities of researchers working with populations shaped by extreme isolation. Beyond science, the story captured the public imagination. Documentaries, podcasts, and articles explored the Hollow legacy, always emphasizing the dual themes of horror and humanity. Sarah Holloway's courage in fleeing with her child became a symbol of defiance against cruelty and neglect, inspiring discussions about morality, survival, and the strength of the human spirit. Her descendants, whether marked by deformity or hidden in plain sight, serve as a living connection to a valley steeped in darkness, reminding the world that the past never truly dies. It lingers in DNA, memory, and shadow. The Hollow descendant stories are not just about horror. They are cautionary tales, lessons in resilience, and reflections on the consequences of isolation and secrecy. Each life carries echoes of Devil's Hollow, a whisper of what happens when humanity is pushed beyond its natural boundaries. Next, we will explore the forbidden rituals, the twisted beliefs, and the dark ceremonies that kept Devil's Hollow shrouded in terror for generations, revealing the macabre heart of the family's legacy. To understand Devil's Hollow, one cannot ignore the dark ceremonies and twisted beliefs that sustained the Holloway family for generations. Isolation was not just geographic. It was ritualistic, spiritual, and psychological. The valley's dense forests and treacherous cliffs shielded the family from outsiders, but also nurtured a culture of fear, obedience, and obsession. The patriarchs, from Jacob to Abel, maintained control through religious manipulation and ritualistic indoctrination. Children were taught from birth that deformities were divine, that suffering was holy, and that the outside world was irredeemably corrupt. Each family member was trained to participate in ceremonies, blending superstition with grotesque displays of power. Blood was not just blood, it was proof of sanctity. Bones were not merely bones. They were talismans linking the living to ancestral spirits. Eyewitness accounts from travelers and trappers, though rare, describe chilling sounds echoing through the valley at night, chanting, weeping, and the unidentifiable cries of infants, their voices layered with fear and the unnatural. The rituals often involve the youngest or weakest members of the family, a horrifying mix of sacred duty and genetic experiment. In a particularly disturbing account, Delilah, the family's self-appointed midwife, instructed Sarah on ceremonial purification, tasks that included isolating newborns with severe deformities and performing symbolic acts meant to cleanse the bloodline. The family's twisted theology held that their physical deformities were marks of divine favor, evidence that God had chosen them to transcend humanity. Yet, for every celebration of deformity, there was punishment for perceived disobedience. Offenders faced confinement, starvation, or cruel public humiliation, often before the entire clan. One journal entry by Abel reads, quote, "The flesh is a mirror of the soul. Only by suffering can purity be achieved." These beliefs extended into marriage and reproduction. Arranged unions, often between siblings, aunts, and uncles, were framed as ritualistic necessities, binding the family's bloodline and sealing the covenant with their distorted faith. Every birth, whether successful or fatal, was seen as a spiritual test, a divine verdict on the family's devotion. The tragic irony is that these ceremonies, intended to sanctify, also accelerated the genetic decay that would culminate in Sarah's infamous child. Outsiders who accidentally wandered into Devil's Hollow reported seeing altars carved from stone, blood-stained relics of unknown origin, and strange effigies that blended human and animal forms. Some trappers claimed the family performed rites during full moons, their shadows flickering across the forest like demons dancing in candlelight. Fear kept the Hollways hidden, but it also ensured that their rituals, however grotesque, continued, uninterrupted, for generations. Sarah, even as a child, witnessed these ceremonies and internalized both terror and a sense of inevitability. Her eventual rebellion, escaping the valley with her child, was more than an act of survival. It was a refusal to perpetuate the rituals that had defined and destroyed her family. That single act of defiance would ripple through decades, marking the end of the family's ceremonial reign and leaving only shattered relics of the Hollow faith behind. Next, we will explore Sarah's desperate journey from Devil's Hollow to St. Mary's Hospital, the perilous escape that would shape history and the terrifying birth that shocked the medical world forever. The night Sarah decided to leave Devil's Hollow was darker than any she had ever known. A new moon hung low, casting the valley into absolute blackness, as if the mountains themselves conspired to keep the whole secrets buried forever. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves could betray her. For 18 years, Sarah had lived under the relentless gaze of her uncle, husband Marcus, the patriarch Abel, and the oppressive weight of generations of inbreeding and twisted rituals. Now, with her third pregnancy, she carried more than life. She carried hope. Her plan was simple, almost desperate in its simplicity. Survive the night, escape the valley, and take her child to a world beyond the mountains. But simplicity meant little against the treacherous terrain and the vigilance of the Holloway clan. She had learned the hidden paths, the camouflaged caves, and the steep ridges that cradled the valley. knowledge passed down through generations. Tonight, that knowledge became her lifeline. Clutching the $17 she had stolen from Marcus' hidden stash, Sarah wrapped herself in the worn cloak she had made from scraps. Every step away from the compound was a gamble. Dogs barked in the distance, echoing like sentinels. Voices murmured through the mist, part warning, part threat. Each step was agony. The mountains were unforgiving, and her malnourished body, weakened by years of insufficient food, protested with every mile. Yet maternal instinct and sheer determination pushed her forward. For 3 days, Sarah crawled through the underbrush, waded across icy streams, and hid in hollow logs and shallow caves. She survived on berries, roots, and the occasional squirrel she managed to catch, an act she never imagined she could commit. Hunger gnawed at her. Exhaustion blurred her vision. And yet fear of returning, fear of Abel, Marcus, and the valley itself was stronger than death. Each night, the valley seemed to chase her. Shadows stretched impossibly long, whispering the whole prayers she had memorized in childhood. Every crack of a branch or hoot of an owl reminded her of the screams she had witnessed during the family's rituals. Infants suffering, children punished, elders preaching the sanctity of deformity. The memories fueled her flight. The screams were no longer just horror. They were her compass, guiding her toward freedom. By the second night, Sarah's condition worsened. Her swelling belly, a constant reminder of the fragile life inside her, made climbing and scrambling nearly impossible. Pain became a constant companion, but so did resolve. She whispered to her unborn child, promising life beyond the valley, a chance that no Hollow had ever dared to dream. That promise became a mantra, pushing her through hunger, pain, and fear. On the third night, when her body was near collapse, Sarah stumbled onto a narrow dirt road, barely visible through the trees. Relief and terror collided. She was visible now, exposed to the outside world. It was here that Robert Welsh, a traveling salesman, found her, delirious and half-conscious. Muttering about devils, angels, and screaming babies, he lifted her into his car, unaware that he was transporting the result of America's most horrifying genetic experiment. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt the faint pulse of hope. The mountains behind her were silent, yet they carried the weight of centuries of whole darkness. Her escape had begun, but what awaited her at St. Mary's Hospital would challenge every instinct of humanity and medical science. Next, we will witness Sarah's arrival at St. Mary's Hospital, the fateful admission under a false name, and the delivery that would shock the world and rewrite the boundaries of human genetics. By the early hours of November 1932, Sarah stumbled into the dimly lit corridor of St. Mary's Hospital, her body nearly broken from days of grueling escape. She was drenched in sweat, dirt caked into her hair, and clothes torn from the relentless terrain. 8 months pregnant, malnourished, and delirious, she clutched her swollen belly like a lifeline, aware that what she carried could either survive or die within her grasp. Sarah's first priority was anonymity. She registered under the false name Mary Smith, weaving a story of being a deserted wife, abandoned and alone. Her dialect, an archaic, almost unintelligible Appalachian speech, made the staff pause, eyebrows raised in confusion and suspicion. Yet the desperation in her eyes and the fragility of her condition made further questioning seem cruel. The nurses, accustomed to mountain folk wary of modern medicine, accepted her strange story, unaware that this young woman was the last hope for a child, carrying 6 generations of genetic isolation. The hospital itself seemed almost serene compared to the horrors of Devil's Hollow, but the calm was deceptive. Every step Sarah took echoed with the memories of the valley, the ritualistic chants, the grotesque ceremonies, the screams of children born malformed and abandoned. She clung to the thought that the outside world offered a chance at life, something she had never known, something every Holloway child had been denied. As she waited, trembling on a worn chair in the admissions room, her hands were shaky but resolute. The stolen $17 in her pocket represented a small but vital tool, passage to freedom, a means to survive, and a promise to her unborn child. She had memorized the hospital layout from fleeting glimpses during previous forced trips for minor injuries, and now relied on that memory to navigate toward safety and assistance. When Dr. Margaret Hayes bowled the room, she saw not just a heavily pregnant woman, but someone profoundly fragile, yet undeniably determined. Sarah's vacant, unfocused eyes hinted at trauma, but behind them glimmered intelligence, a flicker of clarity that suggested she understood exactly what she had to do. She gave no details of the valley, no explanation for the pregnancies, and no hint of the horrors waiting in her lineage. The medical team had no idea that the child about to enter this world would challenge every boundary of human anatomy and heredity. Sarah's calmness, despite her exhaustion, unsettled the staff. There was something otherworldly about her presence, a combination of fear, experience, and maternal instinct, honed under circumstances no ordinary person could comprehend. She moved through triage and into a waiting room, her every movement measured, deliberate, as if preparing herself mentally for the labor ahead. Even in the sterile corridors of St. Mary's, the shadows of Devil's Hollow clung to her, whispering of the centuries of genetic decay and rituals that had preceded her. But Sarah's escape was complete. She had left the valley behind, leaving behind the twisted faith, the punishments, and the inbreeding that had haunted her ancestors for generations. What awaited her here in the hands of doctors and strangers was unknown. But for the first time she dared to believe in survival. Next we will enter the fateful delivery room, where the labor begins, and the child who will become medical history's most disturbing case enters the world. The cold November night pressed heavily against the walls of St. Mary's Hospital, each gust of wind outside whispering secrets of mountains far away. Inside, Sarah lay on the delivery bed, her hands gripping the worn sheets, eyes fixed on some distant point, as if watching the shadows of Devil's Hollow chase her across the room. The nurses bustled quietly, concerned by the obvious strain and exhaustion of this young woman, unaware that they were about to witness a birth that would rewrite the boundaries of human biology. Dr. Margaret Hayes, seasoned and steady after decades of delivering babies, approached with the calm professionalism of someone who had seen it all. Yet even she felt a shiver crawl up her spine as she glanced at Sarah. Something about the woman's eyes, vacant yet burning with an almost unnatural resolve, suggested a history too dark to comprehend. A life molded by isolation, abuse, and impossible heredity had brought her here tonight. Labor began slowly, each contraction a battle against the years of genetic strain that had warped Sarah's body. Her pelvis, misshapen from the inbreeding of generations, resisted natural birth. The nurses exchanged worried glances. Standard positions for delivery did not work. Every maneuver seemed to defy the rules of obstetrics, every approach a compromise with the unknown. Sarah breathed shallowly, whispering words of encouragement to the child she carried. The last hope, the final survivor of 6 generations of genetic decay. Hours stretched on. Pain, fear, and determination intertwined in a rhythm older than medicine itself. Sarah's body, weakened and malnourished, struggled to cooperate. Yet, she fought through exhaustion, with a force that seemed almost superhuman. She muttered fragments of the hollow prayers under her breath, their dark cadence echoing faintly in the sterile hospital room. In her mind, these incantations had once justified horror, but tonight they became a chant of protection, a desperate plea for life beyond the mountains. Then came the moment that would haunt every soul present. The child emerged, alive, yet grotesque, in ways that shocked even Dr. Hayes' extensive experience. Its skull was elongated and partially collapsed, eyes bulging unnaturally. The left arm ended abruptly at the shoulder, while the right bore 7 fingers arranged in an impossible formation, as if two limbs had tried to merge into one. The legs fused into a single mass contained 3 separate skeletal structures, a cruel testament to the family's decades of inbreeding. Dr. Hayes froze, heart pounding. The nurses recoiled, murmuring prayers and expressions of disbelief. Normal pediatric procedures were useless. IVs, oxygen, measurements, even the simplest methods of care failed against the impossible anatomy. The infant's heartbeat was irregular, a chaotic rhythm that seemed to mock the very definition of life. Breathing was shallow, as though the lungs themselves were rebelling against nature. Within minutes, Dr. Edmund Carver, a geneticist from the University of Virginia, was summoned. He examined the child with a mixture of horror and awe, documenting what he would later describe as the most extreme case of genetic compression ever recorded. The child's DNA represented over 9 decades of inbreeding, concentrated to the theoretical limits of human possibility. For exactly 17 minutes, the infant drew breath. Every second was a living testament to the Hollow family's darkest legacy, a brutal culmination of centuries of isolation, ritual, and twisted devotion to genetic purity. When the heartbeat finally ceased, the room fell silent, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired, a moment where humanity's limits had been tested and found grotesquely exposed. Next, he will explore Drive, Carver's secretive research, the aftermath for Sarah, and how this moment of horror shaped the understanding of genetics for decades to come. The moment the infant's chaotic heartbeat finally ceased, the room fell into a haunting silence. Nurses stood frozen, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on their chests. Dr. Margaret Hayes, seasoned yet shaken, wiped her hands and tried to steady her breath. But it was Dr. Edmund Carver who truly understood the magnitude of the horror before him. The child, the product of 6 generations of extreme inbreeding, was more than a medical anomaly. It was a living testament to humanity's darkest impulses, and now it was gone in just 17 minutes. Carver, a geneticist whose work had focused on isolated populations in the Appalachian Mountains, immediately recognized the significance. He documented every detail, photographs from every angle, tissue samples, and precise measurements of the malformed body. His notes, meticulous and trembling, with a mix of fear and fascination, would later form the foundation for what became a landmark study in extreme consanguinity. But at that moment, Carver knew he had to tread carefully. The implications were too vast, the reactions from the scientific and public communities too unpredictable. The Holloway family's secret had to remain locked away, at least for now. Sarah, sedated and drained from the harrowing labor, was unaware of the chaos surrounding her. To the nurses, she appeared calm, almost unnaturally so. Her vacant eyes hid a mind burdened with grief, relief, and the faintest glimmer of hope. She had survived. Her child had lived, and now the mountains of Devil's Hollow were behind her. Yet the trauma of years under Abel and Marcus, tyranny clung to her like a shadow. She had scribbled a note in cramped, shaky handwriting, words heavy with despair and resignation. The devil's work is done. I go to make peace with God. 3 days later, Sarah's body was found torn and broken at the bottom of a ravine 50 mil sand from the hospital. Local authorities ruled it a suicide, unaware of the lineage, the horrors, or the significance of the child she had carried. For decades, the story remained buried, a footnote of tragedy in obscure hospital records, while Dr. Carver continued his private, painstaking research. Over the next 40 years, Carver's obsession grew. He meticulously traced the Hollow family tree, piecing together decades of inbreeding, hidden marriages, and grotesque rituals. Each new discovery amplified the horror, patterns of deformities, severe developmental disabilities, and mutations that would challenge even the most extreme laboratory studies. He realized that the Holloways had unknowingly conducted a century-long experiment in human genetics, pushing the boundaries of heredity far beyond anything ethical or imaginable. Carver shared his findings with only a handful of trusted colleagues, all sworn to secrecy. He feared that public knowledge might incite panic, ridicule, or worse, inspire eugenic ideologies already gaining traction in 20th century America. The data remained in a secure vault, an unspoken warning of what isolation and obsession with genetic purity could produce. The legacy of Sarah and her child would not end in silence. Though short-lived, the infant became a cornerstone for understanding the devastating effects of extreme inbreeding. Modern geneticists still reference Carver's work, studying it to prevent tragedies like the Holloways from recurring. And for Sarah, the brief act of escape, her flight from the mountains, her courage to seek medical help, remains a monument to resilience and maternal instinct, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Next, we will examine how the Holloway family was rediscovered decades later, and how Devil's Hollow, once shrouded in secrecy, revealed its full horrifying history to the world. For decades, the Holloway family and their cursed valley remained nothing more than rumors whispered among Appalachian trappers and genealogists. Devil's Hollow had disappeared from maps. Its twisted cabins collapsed under years of neglect, and its forests had reclaimed every path, stream, and hidden grave. Few dared approach, recalling the strange cries and unholy chants heard long ago. The valley, shrouded in fog and superstition, seemed to breathe its secrets into the mist. It wasn't until 1987, almost 60 years after Sarah's desperate escape, that a team of genealogical researchers stumbled across the first clues. They were tracing old family records, piecing together census anomalies and impossible familial connections, when the name Holloway repeatedly surfaced, often linked to children who vanished without explanation, or families that seemed to defy the logic of genetics. The researchers were intrigued, and soon their curiosity turned into an obsession. They wanted to see the land for themselves, to understand the legend firsthand. The journey to Devil's Hollow was treacherous. The single pass into the valley was overgrown with brambles, and decades of neglect had turned familiar landmarks into twisted, almost alien forms. The forest seemed to resist their progress, as if nature itself were guarding the secrets buried beneath. When they finally reached the heart of the valley, they were met with an eerie silence. The cabins were skeletal remains of the once thriving community. Roofs caved, walls splintered, furniture decayed, and nature claiming every inch. The air carried a faint metallic tang, the scent of old earth and forgotten lives. Among the ruins, the researchers discovered the Holloway family cemetery, partially hidden beneath thick undergrowth. Over 200 graves, most unmarked, lay scattered across the slope. The markers that remained were crude, some wooden crosses rotted and fallen, others barely legible stone slabs. Many graves were small, infantized, reminders of lives cut tragically short. As they dug through the records buried under decades of leaves, it became horrifyingly clear the majority of the Hollow children had never lived to see their FTH birthday. What struck the researchers most wasn't just the sheer number of graves. It was the patterns of names and dates, repetitions of the same surnames, overlapping birth years, and connections that defied normal generational timelines painted a chilling picture of systematic inbreeding carried out for nearly a century. Every corner of the cemetery told a story of desperation, secrecy, and survival at an unspeakable cost. The rediscovery of Devil's Hollow reignited interest in Dr. Carver's decades-old research. For the first time, modern scientists and historians could physically verify the valley's existence, cross-referencing his notes with the remnants of the family's hidden world. DNA studies conducted in the late 1980s confirmed the horrifying truth. The Holloway family represented one of the most extreme cases of human genetic isolation ever documented. The valley had been a breeding ground for mutation, deformity, and tragedy, entirely cut off from the outside world. Today, Devil's Hollow stands as a silent monument to the dangers of isolation and the consequences of human obsession with blood purity. The land itself, reclaimed by forest and fog, holds no living inhabitants, Yet the shadows of the Holloways linger. Every fallen cabin, every unmarked grave, every twisted root and stone whispers the story of a family that dared to defy nature only to pay the ultimate price. Next, we delve into how modern geneticists use Carver's findings to prevent similar tragedies, and what the Hollow legacy teaches us about heredity, ethics, and nature. The story of Devil's Hollow, long hidden beneath layers of fog and superstition, did more than shock historians and genealogists. It became a cornerstone for modern genetic science. Dr. Edmund Carver's meticulously collected data, once locked away in secrecy, finally entered the hands of researchers who could fully grasp the implications of centuries of isolation and inbreeding. For decades, geneticists had studied isolated populations. But the Holloways represented something almost unimaginable. 6 generations of deliberate consanguinity, creating what Carver called a genetic compression catastrophe. In modern laboratories, Carver's notes were no longer just historical curiosity. They were a blueprint for understanding how extreme genetic bottlenecks affect human development. Researchers studied tissue samples from Sarah's infant and from the scattered remains in the Hollow cemetery. What they found confirmed Carver's grim observations. Mutations compounded exponentially, leading to deformities, organ malformations, and cognitive impairments that would be considered impossible under normal genetic circumstances. These findings transformed how scientists thought about hereditary risk, isolation, and human adaptability. One of the most important lessons from the Veuve de Fond Holloway case was the importance of genetic diversity. Unlike laboratory studies, which could control variables, the Holloway's genetic isolation occurred naturally, albeit enforced through fear, superstition, and deliberate family rules. Each successive generation inherited not just the visible deformities, but underlying weaknesses in immune function, organ development, and neurological health. Modern geneticists now use the Holloway data to model the risks of consanguinity and its impact on population health, providing crucial guidance for isolated communities around the world. Ethicists also found the story compelling, though, for entirely different reasons. The Holloway legacy is more than a scientific case study. It is a cautionary tale about human hubris, secrecy, and the moral consequences of isolating a population. The family's rigid adherence to blood purity, enforced through arranged marriages and extreme isolation, resulted in suffering that spanned generations. Today, ethicists cite the Holloways in discussions about genetic counseling, reproductive rights, and the limits of human interference with heredity. The story reminds us that every choice in reproduction carries ethical weight, particularly when it affects not just one life, but entire lineages. The whole narrative also provides insight into resilience and survival against impossible odds. Sarah, born into this cursed lineage, achieved a degree of cognitive function rare for her family. Her brief attempt to protect her own child, to escape the valley, and seek medical care represents a glimmer of hope amid centuries of despair. Modern scientists marvel not only at the catastrophic genetic consequences of the Holloway's isolation, but also at how some individuals managed to retain fragments of normal development despite overwhelming odds. Today, medical textbooks and genetic journals include case studies based on Carver's work. His papers are referenced in research on genetic bottlenecks, congenital malformations, and rare hereditary syndromes, making the whole story a living lesson in the fragile interplay between heredity, environment, and human decision-making. Yet, the story's value extends beyond science. It is a warning to societies everywhere about the dangers of isolation, secrecy, and placing ideology above human life. Next, we uncover the final remnants of Devil's Hollow and explore how descendants of isolated populations continue to grapple with genetic and social consequences in modern America. Even decades after Devil's Hollow was rediscovered, the story of the Holloway family continued to resonate, not only as a scientific warning, but as a haunting reminder of what generations of isolation can do to a lineage, While the valley itself lay empty, reclaimed by forest and silence, traces of its inhabitants lived on in the DNA of scattered descendants. Some had escaped the valley, others had been hidden away, and a few had managed to integrate into neighboring communities. Yet, all bore the invisible weight of genetic inheritance, a legacy both subtle and devastating. Genealogical researchers in the 1980s and 1990s began to trace these descendants, often uncovering shocking patterns. Families once proud of their heritage discovered rare congenital disorders, unusual physical deformities, and cognitive challenges in members whose ancestors had emerged from Devil's Hollow. In certain cases, children displayed symptoms that echoed the extremes documented in Carver's research: limb anomalies, facial malformations, and neurological impairments. Modern genetics revealed the grim truth. Even a single generation outside the valley could not erase centuries of concentrated mutations. But alongside the tragedy was a story of resilience. Some descendants exhibited remarkable cognitive and physical abilities, defying the genetic odds stacked against them. These individuals became living examples of nature's unpredictability, proof that even the darkest legacy cannot completely dictate the course of life. Geneticists studying these cases marveled at the balance of catastrophic mutation and survival, where devastating consequences coexisted with unexpected resilience. Sociologically, the Hollow descendants faced unique challenges. Communities surrounding Devil's Hollow had long treated survivors and their families as outsiders. The stigma of the Hollow name persisted, and decades after the valley's abandonment, oral histories recounted by local elders included warnings, folklore, and whispered tales of children born strange, of families shunned, and of unexplained tragedies. For descendants, the story of their bloodline was not just biological, it was cultural, social, and psychological, shaping identities and community relations for generations. Modern genetic counseling often references these cases to illustrate the importance of early intervention and education in isolated populations. Researchers use the Hollow legacy to teach families about inheritance patterns, recessive gene expression, and the dangers of extreme consanguinity. Beyond the classroom, the story serves as a moral lesson. Secrecy, fear, and obsession with purity can echo across generations, leaving consequences that far outlast the original actors. Yet perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in memory. The Hollow descendants, now scattered across Appalachia and beyond, carry not only the burden of genetic legacy, but the weight of history. They are living reminders that human choices, however hidden or justified, have consequences, sometimes measured in physical deformities, sometimes in lost lives, and sometimes in the haunting silence of an abandoned valley. In the next section, we will explore how modern science continues to uncover similar isolated populations and how the lessons of Devil's Hollow are guiding geneticists, ethicists, and communities worldwide to prevent history from repeating itself. The Holloway family may have been extreme, but their story is far from unique. Around the globe, researchers have identified isolated populations where generations of limited gene flow produced startling consequences. From rare hereditary disorders to unusual physical traits, from remote valleys in Appalachia to secluded islands in the Pacific, the Holloway case became a template for understanding the impact of genetic isolation on human communities. Anthropologists and geneticists note that when communities remain isolated, both culturally and geographically, the risks of inherited disorders multiply. Small populations, particularly those practicing endogamy or arranged marriages within the same bloodline, face what scientists call a genetic bottleneck, a phenomenon vividly illustrated by the Holloways. By studying other isolated groups, researchers realized that the Hull Valley was an extreme example, but one that held critical lessons. Take, for example, remote Scottish islands, where families lived for centuries with minimal contact with outsiders. Certain rare conditions, metabolic disorders, heart defects, and skeletal abnormalities appeared far more frequently than in the general population. Similar patterns emerged in isolated Amazonian tribes and mountain villages in Central Asia. In each case, long-term isolation amplified genetic risks, just as the Holloway lineage had demonstrated. Scientists now use these populations to predict, prevent, and manage hereditary diseases, leveraging the lessons learned from Carver's meticulous research. But beyond the clinical implications, there's a social and ethical dimension. The Hollow story illustrates that isolation is rarely just biological. It is often reinforced by social structures, cultural beliefs, and fear. Communities that enforce strict endogamy may do so out of tradition, superstition, or survival straitjacket. Yet, history from Devil's Hollow to modern examples shows that these practices can inadvertently magnify human suffering across generations. Today, public health officials and genetic counselors use these case studies to educate populations about the importance of genetic diversity, responsible marriage practices, and early screening for inherited conditions. The Holloway case also ignited global conversations about ethics in genetic research. Carver's once secret studies, when finally published, challenged scientists to balance curiosity with responsibility. They prompted questions. Should researchers intervene in isolated communities? How far should genetic counseling go in respecting cultural traditions while preventing harm? The answers remain nuanced, but the Hollow story is a stark reminder that science alone cannot shield humanity from the consequences of isolation. It requires ethical foresight and compassion. Finally, the Hollow legacy underscores the fragile resilience of the human genome. Even in populations with severe genetic constraints, survival persists. Mutations, though often harmful, can coexist with remarkable resilience, producing individuals capable of thriving against all odds. This duality, devastation, and perseverance intertwined is a central lesson from Devil's Hollow, one that continues to influence modern genetics, anthropology, and ethics. Next, we explore the final chilling revelations from Devil's Hollow and the ultimate warning these centuries-old secrets offer for humanity today. By the time researchers rediscovered Devil's Hollow in the late 1980s, decades had passed since Sarah Hole's desperate escape. The valley, once teeming with the Hollow family's twisted legacy, lay silent and overgrown. Yet, it spoke volumes to anyone willing to look closely. What historians, geneticists, and anthropologists found was a haunting record of human obsession, secrecy, and the limits of heredity. The Holloway Cemetery alone told a story that no document could fully capture. Over 200 graves, most unmarked, held the remains of children who had never taken a single step outside the valley, their lives cut short by the consequences of generations of inbreeding. Skeletal remains revealed extra limbs, fused bones, and cranial deformities, confirming the horrifying patterns Carver had documented decades earlier. For forensic scientists, the valley was an open-air laboratory, but one that carried a weight too heavy to be purely scientific. Each grave was a reminder of the human cost of isolation and secrecy. Local legends, once dismissed as folklore, gained startling credibility. Villagers spoke of strange lights in the forest, screams that echoed without source, and children born with impossible features. Anthropologists pieced together accounts of ritualistic practices, religious ceremonies, and strict enforcement of genetic purity, painting a portrait of a community trapped in a cycle of obsession. It became clear that Abel and his ancestors had created not just a family, but an entire ecosystem of control and fear where deviation was punished and survival depended on conformity. Carver's long-suppressed research added another layer of horror. His DNA analyses revealed that the Holloways had achieved a genetic isolation so extreme that the child Sarah carried in 1932, already the product of 6 generations, represented the outermost boundaries of human reproduction. Modern genetic modeling confirmed his conclusions. The family's accumulated mutations were both extensive and catastrophic, with no practical hope of correction. Every attempt to intervene, every marriage within the valley only deepened the genetic bottleneck. Yet among the devastation were traces of resilience and adaptation. Some descendants who had left the valley carried surprising genetic robustness, a reminder that even the most extreme pressures of heredity cannot entirely erase survival instincts encoded in DNA. These individuals became living proof that humanity's story is not only about tragedy, it is also about unexpected endurance. Perhaps the most chilling revelation, however, was moral rather than medical. Devil's Hollow illustrated how fear, secrecy, and rigid control can amplify the consequences of isolation. Families may cling to tradition or superstition, but when choices are made without regard for ethics, biology, or compassion, the consequences echo through generations. The Hollow story became not merely a case study, but a cautionary tale for humanity itself. Isolation, whether genetic, social, or moral, carries a price. Next, we will conclude this journey through Devil's Hollow with a reflection on the lessons it leaves for modern science, ethics, and the fragile tapestry of human life. The Holloway family's saga, spanning over a century, is more than a story of genetic horror. It is a cautionary tale that resonates deeply with modern science and ethics. What happened in Devil's Hollow is a stark reminder that human decisions, when compounded by isolation and secrecy, can have consequences that echo across generations. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the limits of heredity, the responsibilities of science, and the ethical dilemmas inherent in genetic research. Dr. Edmund Carver's research, once hidden in a private vault, became a landmark in the field of genetics. His painstaking documentation of the Holloway family demonstrated the effects of extreme consanguinity in ways that textbooks could only describe in abstract terms. By the time his work was published in 1984, the scientific community recognized that genetic isolation is not just a theoretical risk. It can produce outcomes that defy imagination, from structural deformities to profound cognitive impairments. Carver's findings now serve as a critical resource for genetic counselors, medical ethicists, and population biologists. Yet, the Holloway case also presents an ethical paradox. While the data Carver collected offered unprecedented insight, the cost, both human and moral, was staggering. Researchers today debate how far science should go in studying isolated populations. Consent, respect for cultural norms, and the potential for harm remain central concerns. The Holloway story illustrates that knowledge alone is not sufficient. Ethical application is equally essential. It is a lesson that reverberates in debates over genetic modification, eugenics, and experimental interventions. Modern genetics has learned to balance observation with intervention. Communities at risk of genetic bottlenecks can now benefit from screening programs, genetic counseling, and public health initiatives, tools unimaginable in Sarah Hull's time. The story of Devil's Hollow underscores why these measures matter. Without guidance, isolation, whether by geography, tradition, or choice, can amplify human suffering in ways that science alone cannot prevent. Beyond the lab, the Holloway narrative resonates with social and moral implications. It highlights the dangers of rigid hierarchies, blind obedience, and the dehumanization that comes when secrecy and fear govern daily life. Abel's manipulation of the family, the arranged unions, and the glorification of deformities as divine signs created a closed system of oppression, leaving generations vulnerable to both genetic and psychological damage. The ethical lesson is clear. Communities cannot afford to ignore the consequences of their cultural practices, nor can science ignore the humanity behind the data. Perhaps most importantly, the Holloway saga teaches us about resilience and responsibility. While the valley produced unspeakable suffering, it also left traces of survival, descendants who escaped, researchers who documented the truths, and a modern scientific framework capable of preventing similar tragedies. The story urges humanity to heed the consequences of isolation, embrace genetic diversity, and approach science with moral vigilance. Next, in our final section, we reflect on the enduring legacy of Devil's Hollow and the warning it offers to every generation that seeks to hide its darkest secrets. The story of Devil's Hollow concludes not with closure, but with a lingering chill, a reminder that some secrets refuse to die quietly. The Hollow family, their lives intertwined with centuries of isolation, cruelty, and obsession, left a mark that modern science, ethics, and human imagination still grapple with. The valley itself may be silent, overgrown, and abandoned. Yet, its legacy persists, echoing in the shadows of every discussion about genetic isolation and the moral limits of human intervention. By the time the last fragments of the whole story reached public knowledge in the 1980s, researchers realized the full magnitude of what had occurred. The child born to Sarah Hole in 1932, living a mere 17 minutes, became a symbol of the consequences of human arrogance, secrecy, and inbreeding. It was a living testament, brief, fragile, and horrifying, of what happens when natural laws are ignored in pursuit of obsessive ideals. That fleeting life carried 6 generations of genetic distortions, a silent witness to a family's darkest impulses. Dr. Edmund Carver, whose decades of secret research illuminated the horrors hidden in the Appalachian valleys, understood that the whole story was not merely about science. It was a moral warning. Extreme isolation, whether cultural, geographic, or genetic, comes with a cost. Humanity may possess the intelligence to observe and analyze, but without ethical restraint, knowledge alone cannot prevent suffering. The Hollways are a mirror, reflecting what happens when humans attempt to control heredity, manipulate bloodlines, and conceal their actions from the world. In a broader context, the story challenges our perception of progress and civilization. Even in a nation that prides itself on scientific achievement and social advancement, small pockets of humanity can regress into horror, hidden from view. The valley's eventual discovery in 1987 confirmed that nature itself can mask centuries of tragedy. Ramshackle cabins, overgrown paths, and collapsed graves silently narrated a chronicle of neglect, obsession, and unintended consequences. Yet the whole tale also holds lessons of resilience. Some descendants who escaped carried the potential for recovery. Modern genetics, now armed with advanced understanding and technology, offers pathways to prevent similar tragedies. Programs promoting genetic counseling, population diversity, and ethical oversight act as shields against repeating the mistakes of Devil's Hollow. The story underscores that awareness, vigilance, and moral courage are as vital as scientific knowledge itself. Finally, the Holloway saga is a warning that transcends science. Secrets, when buried, do not remain buried. Isolation, cruelty, and unethical practices ripple across time, leaving indelible scars. The 17-minute life of Sarah Holloway's child, the abandoned valley, and the haunted cemeteries remind us that human actions, especially when driven by obsession or fear, can echo far beyond the individuals involved. As we close the chapter on Devil's Hollow, remember this: some legacies are too dark to ignore, too potent to vanish, and too instructive to be forgotten. The Holloway family's tragedy is a lesson for every generation, a chilling proof that the past carries the power to shape the present, and that some shadows never truly lift.